Hi everyone, and welcome back to English Digest. I'm Pat.
I'm Leah.
And today we're on the third part of our article, Greed Punished in Pushkin's The Queen of Spades. We've done a lot of talking about the Queen of Spades itself and greed, so now we're going to look at Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, the writer of this story. And we're going to look at his life, and we might, as we read through, you might wonder what were the things in his life that maybe contributed to the story. It's often interesting to look at the life of an author and think, what about them are they putting into the stories that they tell? Because authors kind of have to do that to make them believable. They give up a little bit of themselves into the writing.
Yeah, a lot of times they'll create a character that is basically themselves in the writing, and that's what makes it so fascinating because for the people who study literary history, they will go in and learn all about the history of this writer and the time that they lived in, and they will analyze maybe all the letters and things from the writer and all the correspondence they had with their friends and family and all the stories they know about the writer, and they'll say, that is why he married his second cousin on this month in July or something like that. They will really look into it.
Yeah, like we found yesterday that the inspiration for the Queen of Spades was related to a real Russian noblewoman who was supposed to have learned the secret of winning this card game. So from that, we can guess, well, Pushkin must have kind of moved in circles where he would have maybe met the woman or heard the story.
Right,
so
his peers might have been noble
Yeah,
people.
He's unlikely to have been just like a poor person or someone from the middle class who just wrote a lot. There's a good chance he moved in high society.
Absolutely.
So let's check this out by reading through day 3 and seeing what else there is to learn about Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin, 1799 to 1837, was a major figure in Russian literature, with many considering him a founder of the literary movement that began in the 1830s. Pushkin's talent was not in question, but he courted controversy during his lifetime and ended up dying young after suffering a fatal wound in a duel. Born into a noble family, Pushkin published his first poem when he was just 15. However, another poem, Ode to Liberty, saw him exiled by Russian Emperor Alexander I. Pushkin was a great believer in liberty and social reform, but his politics and philosophy were not shared by Russia's rulers. Even when he was allowed to return, his works were reviewed before being published, and he was banned from traveling without prior approval. Despite this, he completed the verse novel Eugene Onegin, which was serialized between 1825 and 1832 before being published as a complete edition in 1833. The story, which follows the life of a wealthy but bored and purposeless man, established this character type as a mainstay of Russian literature that was imitated by many future writers. Eugene Onegin was not Pushkin's only masterpiece. He was a master of all forms of writing, from short stories and poems to plays and non-fiction works. In each of these, he blended European influences with Russian culture and the idiomatic speech of everyday Russians. In this way, he inspired greats like Leo Tolstoy and Ivan Turgenev. The United Nations, UN, decided to make Pushkin's birthday, June 6th, UN Russian Language Day as a tribute to the man many consider the father of modern Russian language and literature.
All right, so our section today starts out with Alexander Pushkin, 1799 to 1837, was a major figure in Russian literature, with many considering him a founder of the literary movement that began in the 1830s. That's a lot of words, not a lot of vocabulary words that we need to look at, but we can still talk about it a little bit. We know he was only alive for 38 years, from 1799 to 1837. And he wasn't just a little writer that showed up on the Russian scene. He was a major figure. So it's kind of like the Alvin and the Chipmunks scene where they drink coffee and they go, major rock star. He was a major figure in Russian literature.
Yeah, I guess if you only live for around 38 years, but you have such a big effect, then you burn pretty brightly in that period.
Especially if you're called a founder, right? Founder of a literary movement. That's huge. That's not a small thing at all.
Yeah, a founder is somebody who starts something, creates that thing. So his work kind of kicked off a lot of other people to write similar kind of things, similar stories, use his style, kind of inspired a lot of the people around him, and started a whole movement of people writing about not identical, but similar ideas, using similar ways of writing to get this whole thing going in the 1830s.
And he was there in the time of the Romanticist movement in writing. But a lot of times, if you look into his life, you'll see that he was the founder of Russian modern literature and also the founder of literary poetry. I don't know if that's only in Russia, but wow, okay. He did a fair few things.
Yeah, as we see, Pushkin's talent was not in question. So there's no doubt that he was extremely good. Nobody is saying, well, he was okay, but was he great? No. We know he was an extraordinary writer.
Legendary.
Yeah. But he courted controversy during his lifetime and ended up dying young after suffering a fatal wound in a duel.
I love this. Courted controversy.
Yeah. So controversy or controversy, you can kind of pronounce it both ways. This is the idea that it's a subject or it's a thing that not everybody agrees about. It raises people's passions and it might get a lot of people angry. It might get a lot of people supporting you. But it's certainly a difficult, kind of awkward topic to deal with.
And if you're courting it, it means you're chasing it. So, for example, if a man is courting a woman, he's trying to date her in the old style way of things. He would have gone to her house. He would have brought her flowers. He would have sat on her porch. He would have had a cup of tea with her. And then he would have gone away. And then he would have maybe taken her to movies another night. That would have been courting her. But he is not courting a woman. He is not chasing after this woman. He is courting controversy. You can also court danger. You can court adventure, which just means you're kind of chasing after those things.
Yeah, so if there was any kind of difficult subject that maybe people didn't want to discuss, he'd be like, no, I'm discussing it. I'm going to talk about social reform and that'll get me in trouble. Or I'm going to, to do this thing which people are going to frown on. And yeah, and this ended up badly for him. He ended up dying young, 38 or so, after suffering a fatal wound. A fatal wound is a wound that kills you. He was shot, basically, in this duel. You can say duel as well. I know Americans tend to hit the harder D than the British.
I think I probably do both duel and duel. And that's when two people will say, you have insulted me or you have insulted the honor of someone near me. And we're going to have a duel. And in many societies, that was made illegal. But what happens when you have a duel is that two people will go out with their pistols up in the air and they will walk a certain number of steps. They will call it, say it maybe 10 paces or 20 paces. And those are the steps. And they will walk opposite from one another and they'll turn around and shoot. And when they do this, a lot of times they have to have someone with them because if they chicken out, that second in command or that second friend of theirs has to step in and do the duel instead.
Yeah, there's a lot of various kind of etiquette about it, but yeah, he fought someone in this kind of official, not like, they just kind of started fighting, but they agreed, we're going to fight with guns and we're going to do it now or tomorrow morning, and he got wounded and that wound killed him, so that's the fatal wound.
Born into a noble family, Pushkin published his first poem when he was just 15. So as you mentioned earlier, his story has some connection to his life in that he talks about a noble woman, a countess. The history or the inspiration of the story is this noble woman in real life, Russian noblewoman, who played the game Pharaoh. And he was actually born into a noble family. So there's that connection there. And a noble family means a family that is in a good position in society. They've maybe been given titles by the ruler of the country. They've maybe been given some land. They have had money maybe for 200-300 years possibly or more. And a lot of times noble families will continue to marry together because that keeps the power all in one group of people's hands.
So he published a poem when he was 15, which is pretty impressive going.
That's a Mozart-y sort of thing
yeah,
to do.
People would have thought this guy is going to be great. He's going to be a leading light of our literary movement. However, another poem, Ode to Liberty, saw him exiled by Russian Emperor Alexander I. So an ode is a lyrical poem. It's a poem that really addresses a single subject and praises it. So you might write an ode to a person and really praise them with lots of beautiful words and lines and rhythms and stuff. In this case, he's praising liberty, freedom, which may not have made him too popular with the Russian emperors who would have been like, freedom, that's for us, not for you.
Right. So what happened was he was exiled. He was kicked out. He was told, hey, you know what? You don't need to be in Russia. This empire will be fine without you. You go away. So he was kicked out of the Russian Empire. And Pushkin was a great believer in liberty, therefore he wrote Ode to Liberty, and social reform. So reform here means change or improvement. So improvements in society to make people's lives better. That's what he was really a great believer in. He wanted that to happen. But his politics and philosophy were not shared by Russia's rulers.
Yeah, this was the time when a lot of Russians they called them serfs. They weren't exactly slaves, but they basically belonged to the land.
Right.
So if you belong to the land, the person who owns the land can tell you what to do. It was a very, very kind of distinct class system of the rulers and the ruled. And Pushkin and many others around that time felt like the common people should have more freedom. There should be moves towards democracy. You'd had the French Revolution happening just not long before he was born. So the idea of getting rid of kings and the old ways. So that's what he was into. That was his philosophy. Your philosophy is your beliefs and also the way you live your life, the way you think about life and what you believe is true, what you believe should happen, the things that guide you in your decisions.
And even when he was allowed to return, so they said, okay, you were exiled, you were kicked out of the empire. You know what? You can come on back, but we're going to have some things that we're going to do. So even when he was allowed to come back, his works were reviewed before being published. That means someone looked over them and said, yeah, you can't say this, and we're going to take this part out. And you know what? Maybe we shouldn't discuss politics. And that's what they're talking about being reviewed. You could almost put that in quotation marks because what it means is someone's going through with a marker and taking out your viewpoint and getting rid of it. So what you are actually saying is allowed. And he was banned from traveling without prior approval.
If you're banned from something, you're banned from doing something. We often use the ing form after this, banned from walking here, banned from smoking in this building, that kind of thing. It's forbidden. You are not allowed to do it. So Pushkin was not allowed to travel. He wasn't allowed to go from city to city or go outside of Russia unless somebody had asked him, okay, where are you going? Where are you staying? How long are you going for? Who are you going with? They needed to check it and give their prior approval. Prior just means before. So he needed to apply to, like you would at work. I need to apply for leave. He needed to apply to take a vacation from Russia. Okay, we're going to take a short break now. We'll listen to our Chinese teacher for a moment. And when we come back, we're going to be looking at more of the works of Alexander Pushkin. See you shortly.
听众朋友大家好，我是安娜。我们昨天跟前天带大家看了黑桃皇后这个故事，还有它这个故事的主题，包括像贪婪啊 greed， 还有一些自然、超自然跟现实之间到底 what's real, what's not real。那今天要带大家看一下这个作者就是 Pushkin。普希金呢，他是俄国文学之父哦，他还蛮重要的。那一开始的段落啊，我们第一段就先提到这个俄国文学之父普希金，他是1799年到1837年，他其实是18到19世纪的一个很重要的俄国文学的重要的人物。那为什么很重要呢？因为很多人都觉得他其实是文学运动啊，就是当时俄国1830年文学运动的一个奠基者。那我刚刚提到的这个文艺出现在第一段的第一句，不过在逗点之后啊，这边的 with 要特别抓出来。像我们刚刚说，很多人啊是认为他是1830年代这个文学运动的奠基者，我们会觉得要造一个句子嘛。 可其实在这里只要用 with 表示附带状况这个句型就可以了。像这里啊，逗点之后的附带状况 with， 因为受到 with 是介系词的关系，所以后面的认为他如何如何的 consider 这个认为就会直接加动词 ing。 像这种描述的手法，我们常会中文看到动词，很多人的认为就想要用动词，但是如果在英文表达当中可以适切的用介系词带上动词 ing， 其实可以让句子会更精简哦。好，那接下来我们就来看一下 Pushkin。 当然除了他是一个文学运动奠基者，基本上他本身就很有才华啦。不过呢，他在有生之年啊却饱受争议，而且最后居然死于一场 duel， 一个决斗，所以他其实很年轻啊，英年早逝，30几岁啊就过世了。接下来我们就来看一下第二段哦。他出生其实是在一个贵族家庭，当然第二段的第一句又是个分词构句啦 ，born into。被出生在一个 noble family， 谁呀？当然主词是逗点之后的 Pushkin。Pushkin 呢，他在15岁就发表第一首诗，算是真的很有才华。不过他的另外一首诗在第二句的地方很重要。第二句这边我们看到的双引号，他的作品 Ode to Liberty 自由颂，这个自由颂却让他被俄罗斯皇帝给流放了。为什么呢？因为其实 Pushkin 他是一个坚信自由跟社会改革的一个文学家。同样在第二段的第3句很重要哦，自由在这里看到的是 liberty， 不是一般的我们所谓的 freedom， 哦，你今天要吃面还是吃饭 No， 这个 liberty 是一种人权，拥有自己人权的一个自由的 liberty。 还有就是所谓的社会改革 social reform。那当然他这样子的一个政治观跟他的 philosophy 好，同样出现在第3句，就不被当时的俄国皇帝所接受，所以他就被流放啦。甚至到流放到什么样的一个状况呢？即使他获准返乡，他的作品在发表之前都要先经过审查，要不然这个皇帝很担心他会传送很多的 liberty 啊 social reform 啊这样子的一个概念。而且甚至呢，他甚至还会被禁止，如果没有被批准都不可以到处的去旅行。我们在同样第二段第4句这个地方，首先作品被审查这个动词啊，我们看到逗点之后看到 review 这个字，有没有要被审查 review。最后面呢，看到的是 ban 这个动词， ban 就是所谓的禁止。那禁止已经是一个否定的字眼，最后面有一个 without， 如果没有被批准的话 without prior 指的是之前的， approval 则是批准的意思。所以如果没有事前的批准，就会被禁止旅行。它有点负负得正的感觉，只要经过批准才能够旅行，如果没有被批准的话，甚至还不能自由的旅行呢。
All right, everybody, we're going to take a little pause for the moment. Stay with us, and we'll be right back in just a few seconds. Welcome back, guys. We're talking about Alexander Pushkin, the legendary, major figure in Russian literature, who really influenced a lot of people and who had his very strong beliefs in social reform. And his philosophy was that, life should be lived for liberty, for freedom a bit more. And this caused him some problems that we were talking about earlier. And yet now he's gotten to the point where he's allowed back in his country. He's no longer exiled. But there's just one little problem. Every time he writes something, someone has to say, yes, you can do this, or no, you can't. And despite this, he completed the verse novel Eugene Onegin, which was serialized between 1825 and 1832 before being published as a complete edition in 1833.
So when something is serialized, that means it appears either one chapter or a few chapters at a time, often in a magazine or a newspaper that is circulated. If you think of people like Charles Dickens or
Oliver Twist and David Copperfield were both serialized.
Dumas in France wrote the same way. They would write one chapter at a time and give it over to the newspapers. They'd publish that short chapter. So the chapters tended to be shorter then. But there were a lot of chapters because they often got paid.
They got paid by the chapter.
Yeah, so they would
kept them in work
keep the
this way.
stories going. But the idea is that it's like a TV show. A TV show is serialized. It appears one episode at a time.
This was a highly successful serialized work because it went from 1825 to 1832. 7 years of a serialized story is pretty impressive.
But then it was collected, as a lot of the stories are, collected and published as one version.
Makes me think about whether Sherlock Holmes stories were also serialized. Because you got
were
the complete works.
They were in the Strand magazine.
Right,
You'd sell them one at a time, come out once every few months.
And then you get that complete compilation
Yeah.
of Sherlock. And that's like the book that's the size of the ones we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
the War and Peace and Moby Dick.
And this, interestingly, was a verse novel. So it was written in verse, and that must be incredibly hard to do.
Which I guess is why we know him also as a founder of literary poetry in Russia. Because, well, yeah, writing in verse means you're writing basically in rhyme, right? Kind of Shakespearean
or rhythm,
style.
At least, yeah.
Shakespearean style. You've got one version there that's written in verse as well. The story, which follows the life of a wealthy but bored and purposeless man, established this character type as a mainstay of Russian literature that was imitated by many future writers. So anyway, the story is, you got the ne'er-do-well, right? You got the guy who, he just doesn't really care about what's going on in his life. He's bored. He has no purpose. And that always makes for an interesting character. I mean, I guess that would be the kind of person you could write about for 7 years, because you're always sitting there on the sidelines going, is he finally going to wake up and become a good guy? Who knows? What he is going to do is his character is going to, well, become a mainstay of other characters written in Russian literature. So a mainstay here is something that is very commonly and popularly found in different works. This character type is something that Russian writers seem to like and seem to use over and over again, not just Pushkin after this period.
Yeah, there's definitely a few characters in War and Peace that fit this description. The brothers Karamazov has got a couple of people like this. They're wealthy, they're aristocrats, they get into various kinds of trouble, with gambling and that's what allows them to have all these adventures. They've got enough money and position to travel and have interesting things happen to them and meet women and meet other famous people and other nobles.
They have interesting stories to tell about it.
And since they have no goal, no purpose, some of it is are they going to find a purpose? Are they going to discover what means something in their life? Or are they just going to kind of fail at it?
Well, here we go. In our next paragraph, it says, Eugene Onegin was not Pushkin's only masterpiece. Okay, so it's not the only literary work that he made that was just perfect and magical. That would be a masterpiece, right? Something that is just so wondrous that when you read it, you're like, mwah, that's the best thing ever.
A painting masterpiece. We're talking about like, this is the painter, a great painter at the top of his or her game.
Right.
The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, all of those, like the absolute top work by the masters.
Absolutely.
So Pushkin, was a master of all forms of writing, from short stories and poems to plays and non-fiction works. So yeah, he wrote travel guides, he wrote plays, he wrote short things, long things, poetry, prose, and whatever he tried, it turned out really, really well. He was just a master and could change his style. He wasn't just doing the same thing.
And again, we are talking about a fellow who was born to a noble family, so he had the wherewithal to be able to write these travel stories. It wasn't a fellow, like we talked about earlier, living in the gutter, who really couldn't afford to take these travels and have these experiences. And he also has this next ability as well. In each of these pieces of work that he completed, he blended European influences with Russian culture and the idiomatic speech of everyday Russians. So having the money to know what's going on in Europe probably allowed him, or the position to rub shoulders with people in European society, allowed him to blend this into his writing. When you're talking about blending, you think about blending something in a blender. You're making a smoothie in the morning. You throw some spinach in, you throw some celery in, you throw some apple juice in, you blend it all together and you drink that. That's mixing it all together so it all becomes one thing. So he's blending European influences with Russian culture, and he's also got the idiomatic speech, of everyday Russians. Idioms are some of the most fun things in language, if you think about it. A lot of times they have a historical background or a cultural background that connects to the native speaker who is using that. It lets you know that you are close to a native speaker. So, for example, if I say 说到曹操,曹操就到, right? In English, we'd say speak of the devil, and the devil will show up. But if by knowing these expressions, you know a little bit about Chinese history if you talk about Cao Cao, right? Because it's from, I think, the Warring States.
Three Kingdoms,
the Three Kingdoms, yeah. Okay, sorry. And then maybe I don't know. But also with the speak of the devil, it might have a background as well. And a lot of our idiomatic expressions have some sort of a cultural background that show that we are natives of that language that we are trying to speak.
Idiomatic speech is basically the speech of the people. So what Pushkin was doing, because French influence on writing would have been huge at this point in time,
right.
But he was taking that influence but mixing in real Russian everyday speech, the Russian that people spoke in homes, not in high society, not around the emperors, but real Russian, and putting them together. And this is what creates the Russian literary movement, because
right.
people are like, this is our culture's writing, not borrowed from Europe, not taken from elsewhere. This is us.
A lot of times the movement is created when there's an excitement behind it, right? That gives the motion forward. If you have something new and exciting, then it can become a movement.
Yeah, and in this way, he inspired greats like Leo Tolstoy and Ivan Turgenev. So Tolstoy was the author of War and Peace, Anna Karenina.
Yeah, Turgenev did Fathers and Sons, I think.
And he was also one of the authors who made Russian literature popular in the West.
Okay.
So two big names there that were both influenced by Pushkin.
Two big greats. And a lot of times when we talk about greats, you might talk about a literary great, a musical great, an artistic great, kind of like we were talking about those major figures earlier, or someone who is legendary in their field. The United Nations, UN, decided to make Pushkin's birthday, June 6th, UN Russian Language Day as a tribute to the man many consider the father of modern Russian language and literature. So they are giving a tribute. They are marking something and saying, this is kind of a special treat that we want to give you to say, hey, you are wonderful. You're a rock star in modern Russian language and literature. And we want to show that we appreciate you by giving you a tribute. And this tribute is that this special day, your birthday, is going to be the UN Russian Language Day.
Yeah, because Pushkin and the way he kind of used the real Russian language, kind of like this is the Russian becomes what is Russian. Like by showing it to everybody, it then gets spoken at all levels. It does influence the way people speak, people write, and that just takes over the language of the people and moves it in a certain direction. So perfect reason to make him the father of modern Russian literature and to be the person whose birthday is Russian Language Day. Now we're going to hand over to our Chinese teacher one more time, and then we'll be back to wrap things up.
所以在当时的状况之下，其实 Pushkin 是被政府管得很严格的。但虽然是这样，他还是完成了一个韵文哦。我们在第二段第5句这个地方看到又有另外一个斜体字啦。它另外一个韵文呢叫做 Eugene Onegin。这个中文的翻的就有点长了。总而言之，我们念 Eugene Onegin 这个韵文小说啊，在当时分期连载，然后还完整出版哦。不过这个故事因为很重要、很经典，所以要提一下。在第二段第6句这边我们特别抓出来，这个故事其实是讲一个富有但是很无聊又漫无目的的一个男人的生活，而且他把这个角色啊奠定为俄罗斯文学的中流砥柱。后来有蛮多的作家都会仿效这样子的故事情节，所以在第二段的第6句我们要特别抓出来，因为其实它也有点长。首先呢，先看到主词的 the story 这个故事，逗点之后看到 which follows blah 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 blah， 就是一个补充说明的关系子句。当然我们看到逗点就找后面第2个逗点 man 这个地方左右括号。好，所以这个故事呢，主要的内容就是在讲一个富有无聊男人的慢人的生活。好，真正的动词才出现在逗点之后的 establish， 奠定了 this character type 这种角色的形式。后面有一个 as 是限定这个介系词哦，就是作为什么样子一种身份，变成是一个 mainstay， 当时俄国文学的中流砥柱。但是后面还有一个限定用法关系子句，先行词是 Russian literature 而限定法关系子句从 that 一直到句尾这个地方，我们可以括号起来。That was imitated by many future writers 是未来很多文学家会仿效的一种 Russian literature。当然最后面一段啦，我们就会介绍到还有其他的作品，也不是只有这一些什么诗啦或者是韵文啦，这不是他唯一的杰作，因为其实 Pushkin 精通各种形式的写作，不管是短篇故事啦、诗歌、戏剧啊、非虚构的作品。那么在这些作品当中，最重要的是第3段第3句这个地方，因为他把来自于欧洲的影响跟俄国文学还有俄国人当时的惯用语整个融为一体了，所以透过这种方式，甚至还启发了像托尔斯泰啊、屠格涅夫啊这类的伟大的作家。所以第3段的第3句虽然感觉文法不复杂，但是其实是一个很重点的部分。动词的 blend A with B 是把 A 跟 B 做混合。那后面呢，我们看到接近句尾的地方 everyday Russians， 这个 everyday Russian 就是指的是俄国的一般平民，他们的前面 idiomatic speech， 他们一般的说话的惯用语的方式。所以其实啊，这个 Pushkin 为什么会被称为俄国的文学之父，就是因为这个原因。那当然我们也带大家看了他的经典的作品，希望大家会喜欢哦。我是安娜，我们下次见。
Okay, everybody, we have finished our literature section for this month. And this is it for us for today. We hope you've enjoyed talking about Alexander Pushkin. For English Digest, I'm Leah.
And I'm Pat.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.